You were born in a hole buried deep beneath the snow, in a place that could barely be called home. The air was cold, the darkness endless, and the only sounds were the howling wind and the soft breathing of your mother. The snow weighed heavily on the outside of your den, pressing in on all sides, making everything feel tight and suffocating. Your mother, curled around you and your siblings, was exhausted. She hadn't eaten for weeks, her body running on empty, but she had kept herself alive long enough to get you here. Every breath she took seemed labored, every movement deliberate. Yet despite her exhaustion, she remained by your side, offering what little warmth and protection she could. In this bleak and desolate place, you couldn't see the world yet. To you, everything was dark, a void without shape or color. All you could feel was the warmth of your mother and the need to stay close to her. She was your world, the only source of comfort in this harsh and hostile environment. Your tiny body was curled in close to hers, instinctively competing with your siblings for the best spot, the warmest spot. Even though you were unable to stand or move on your own, the competition for space had already begun. You didn't know it yet, but from this moment on, survival would always be a battle. In the world you were born into, there was no such thing as a traditional family. You had a mother and a father, but their roles were not what you might expect. Your father, the alpha male of the pack, was the leader. He was responsible for marking the territory, leading hunts, and ensuring that no one stepped out of line. He held power, but it was a power that came from survival, not love. Your mother, the lead female, held just as much authority as your father. Her job was to raise you and your siblings, to protect the next generation and keep the pack together. But in this world, their bond wasn't one built on love or affection. It was about survival. And even though they were the alphas, your parents had their roles too. The other wolves in the pack, the subordinates, were responsible for hunting and babysitting. They weren't in charge. They were the ones who served the alphas. Their food came after the alphas had eaten, and they remained with the pack simply because it was safer than being alone in the Arctic. The pack wasn't a family as humans would understand it. It was a survival unit. Everyone had a purpose, and you, as a newborn, were at the very bottom of the hierarchy. Your existence was tolerated because you were the future of the pack, but you were still at the mercy of its rules. No one was going to save you if you fell behind. No one was going to care for you unless it was in the interest of the pack's survival. If the pack had to choose between you and a chance to survive, they wouldn't hesitate to make the choice. This was the Arctic, and the Arctic had no room for sentiment. The sooner you realized that, the better. Your father kept busy marking the pack's borders, making sure no rival wolves or predators came too close. Your mother stayed close to the den, looking after you and your siblings, though her efforts were constantly strained by her own hunger. The other wolves hunted, but the food they brought back was rarely enough for everyone. The pack ate first, and what was left after the adults had their fill might make it to your mother if she was lucky. If she was luckier, you would get what was left of what was left. In these early days, you began to learn that the pack wasn't interested in keeping you alive for the sake of love. The pack was interested in keeping you alive because one day you might be able to contribute to its survival. You learned early that survival was a collective effort, but it was also a ruthless one. You were at the bottom of the food chain, and the higher you were in that chain, the more likely you were to survive. In this world, strength was the ultimate currency, and weakness was a luxury no one could afford. Days passed slowly, and the cold seemed to deepen with every passing moment. As you grew, you slowly began to open your eyes. The world outside was bright, but it was a harsh and unforgiving brightness, the kind that burned into your skin and stung your eyes. The Arctic wind didn't care that you were still figuring out how to exist. You crawled out of the den for the first time, but immediately, you regretted it. The snow was everywhere, beneath your paws, in your fur, and in your face. You didn't understand why your siblings were so eager to explore. They were bigger and stronger than you, and they shoved you aside without thinking. The adults paid you no mind. They had their own responsibilities, their own tasks to focus on. Your father was busy scouting the area, scanning the horizon for potential threats. The other wolves were hunting or bringing back food for the pack. As you stumbled around in the snow, still trying to adjust to this world, you realized you were still completely dependent on your mother. But your mother had her own struggles. She was tasked with feeding 4 mouths, and there wasn't enough food to go around. Every time the pack hunted, the food was prioritized for the older, stronger members. You would be lucky if there was anything left for you, and you quickly learned that hunger was a constant companion. You tried to chew on frozen bones, but the effort felt futile. They were too hard, too cold to break. You were constantly trailing behind, your legs weak and your energy draining. The snow seemed to swallow you with every step, and every time you fell behind, your mother would nudge you forward. But it wasn't out of kindness. It was practicality. If you died, it would be a waste of resources. In the pack, there was no room for weakness. Every day you struggled to keep up, and every time your mother pushed you forward, you felt smaller, weaker. You began to understand that no one was going to carry you. No one was going to make sure you survived if you couldn't keep up. Eventually, the pack began to teach you the basics of survival. The adults took you and your siblings out to watch them hunt. There were no explanations, no guidance. You were just expected to watch and learn. The first hunt was a hare. The adults spread out, silent and deliberate, while you and your siblings were told to stay behind, out of the way. You were supposed to stay quiet, but your hunger was growing, and your impatience made it hard to follow the rules. The hare heard you before the adults had a chance to move, and it bolted into the snow. Your father shot you a look of pure anger, but your mother didn't even spare you a glance. As the days and weeks passed, the Arctic continued its relentless onslaught. The winds howled ceaselessly, and the snow seemed to fall without end, blanketing everything in a thick, suffocating layer. Each gust of wind felt like ice slicing through your fur, chilling you to the bone. The cold was constant. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your very soul, making every step feel like a monumental effort, every breath a struggle. You had grown a little since your first steps into this world, but the landscape around you remained unforgiving. Your legs were still weak, your paws still clumsy in the deep snow. The ground beneath you seemed to shift with every movement, as though the earth itself was conspiring to make survival even more difficult. Yet, despite the odds, you were learning. Slowly, bit by bit, you were becoming more attuned to the demands of this harsh environment. But your survival wasn't just a matter of enduring the cold. It was about strength, physical, mental, and emotional. The pack was watching, waiting for you to show that you were worthy of a place within it. You had been at the bottom of the hierarchy since the day you were born, but the gap between you and your siblings was starting to widen. They were growing stronger, more capable, while you lagged behind. Every time you stumbled, every time you fell, it became more apparent that you had to push yourself harder. No one was going to help you. No one was going to lift you up. Your mother, the one being who had always been there for you, was still there, but even she seemed increasingly distant. Her attention was divided now, shared between you and your siblings and the pack's needs. She had little to offer, and what little warmth she could give was spread thin. The food situation was dire. The pack's hunts often failed, and the scraps that made their way to the den were barely enough to keep everyone alive. You were still far from being able to hunt, and the pack had no time to wait for you to catch up. The adult wolves were too busy with their own roles, scouting the territory, keeping the pack safe, bringing back whatever they could find. Your father, the alpha, never spared a moment for you. He was focused on the larger picture, on making sure the pack was safe and fed. You could see it in his eyes. You were just another mouth to feed, another obstacle to survival. And then there were the hunts. You were taken along on the pack's hunts, though you weren't expected to participate. You were expected to watch, to learn. But what could you learn? You had no idea how to hunt, how to be quiet and still in the snow. You were loud, awkward, and hungry. You made mistakes, and each one was met with sharp glares from your father, silence from your mother. The other wolves didn't even look at you. They were too focused on the task at hand. Your first hunting lesson was with a hare. The adults spread out, moving silently through the snow, as if they were part of the landscape itself. But you, still clumsy and uncoordinated, couldn't keep up. You were loud, your paws sinking too deep into the snow, your body too heavy for the delicate balance of stalking prey. The hare heard you before anyone could move. It bolted, disappearing into the distance. You had failed, and the pack didn't even have to say anything. Their disappointment was clear. The next hunts weren't any better. You tried to imitate the adults, crouching low, moving carefully through the snow. But you weren't ready. You weren't strong enough. The prey always escaped, and each failure felt like a weight on your shoulders. You were learning the harsh truth of life in the pack. The pack didn't have time for failures. If you couldn't contribute, you didn't matter. You were nothing more than a burden, a weight slowing the pack down. And then, the hunger started to hit harder. You were eating less and less, while your siblings grew stronger and faster. They learned quickly, their bodies becoming leaner, their muscles more defined. They were ready to contribute to the pack's survival. You, on the other hand, were still weak, still unable to hunt for yourself. Your body was still too small, too frail, and every day you felt more like an outsider. You weren't sure how much longer you could keep up. Winter had come in full force now. The cold was unrelenting and the snow never seemed to stop falling. The pack moved constantly, searching for anything to eat. The food they brought back was often just enough to keep the adults fed, with only scraps left for the pups. You were at the very bottom of the pack's hierarchy, and that meant you ate last. Every meal was a contest for survival. Every scrap was hard-earned, but even that wasn't guaranteed. Most days, you didn't eat at all. The worst of it came when the pack brought down a caribou. The adults had worked together, using all their strength and skill to bring down the massive creature. But by the time you arrived, there was nothing left but bones. You gnawed on the remnants, convincing yourself that it was enough. But deep down, you knew it wasn't. The hunger gnawed at you, a constant reminder that survival in the Arctic was a battle against time, against the elements, and against your own body. Every night, the pack huddled together for warmth, but you were always shoved to the outside. The wind cut through your fur, biting at your skin. You could feel the cold seep into your bones, freezing you from the inside out. Every breath felt sharp, every moment a reminder that you were alone, even in the company of the pack. You shivered through the nights, wondering if you would ever feel warm again. Yet despite it all, you persisted. You kept moving, kept following, kept trying to keep up with the pack. There were days when it felt like you might collapse from exhaustion, when every step felt like it could be your last. But you pushed forward. There was no choice. If you stopped, if you gave up, you wouldn't survive. The pack didn't wait for anyone. You had to fight to stay alive. And then, as the months passed, you began to feel a shift. You were growing, albeit slowly. You were stronger now, though still far from where you needed to be. The bond between you and your siblings began to change. They were still your competitors, but now they were also your only hope. They were stronger than you, faster than you, but they were also a part of you. In a way, you started to see them as a necessary part of your survival. The pack wasn't just a group of wolves, it was a unit, and you were a part of it. Whether you liked it or not, your life was tied to theirs. But the reality of your situation began to sink in. You were still at the bottom of the hierarchy. The adults weren't going to cut you any slack. You had to prove yourself, or you would be left behind. The harshness of the Arctic was unforgiving, and survival was never guaranteed. The days blended into one another, each colder than the last, as the weight of survival in the Arctic pressed down on you. There was no end in sight to the hardship. No matter how much you tried to block it out, the constant gnawing hunger, the piercing cold, and the never-ending struggle to stay alive were always there, lurking just beneath the surface. The pack kept moving, relentlessly searching for food, for shelter, for anything that might give them a moment of respite from the unforgiving land. But the land was unrelenting. It didn't care who you were or what you wanted. It simply existed, indifferent to your suffering. You had grown over the past months, though your body had yet to catch up with your instincts. Your legs were still weak, your movements awkward and clumsy, but you could feel yourself getting stronger. The pack's territory stretched for miles, and you had learned to navigate it, even if you hadn't yet mastered the art of survival. You were still young, still learning, but the longer you stayed with the pack, the more you understood that there were only two paths in the Arctic: survival or death. Everything else, every other consideration, was secondary. But survival came at a cost. You were still a pup, and despite your growing understanding of the pack's ways, you had yet to prove yourself worthy of a larger role. The pack's hierarchy was a cruel system, and as much as you had learned, you still had no real power. You were a low-ranking member, barely tolerated, and your position in the pack felt more fragile than ever. You had learned that no one was going to help you if you fell behind. The pack wasn't a family in the way humans understood it. It was a machine, cold, efficient, and merciless. Your mother, the only being who had ever shown you any semblance of affection, was still there, but she was distant. She had no time for sentimental bonds. She had 4 pups to care for, and survival was always the top priority. She had to feed you, but she had to feed herself too. And when the food was scarce, as it often was, she couldn't afford to be concerned with whether you ate first or second, whether you were full or hungry. Her attention was divided, and though you could sense her love for you, it was overshadowed by the reality of the situation. The other wolves were no help. Your siblings had become more independent, and their focus was always on their own survival. They were growing stronger, faster, more capable with each passing day. It seemed like they were constantly one step ahead of you, always getting the better share of food, always learning faster, always getting stronger. They were the ones who would thrive. They were the ones who would eventually move up in the pack's hierarchy. And you, well, you were left behind. You were learning the harsh truth. No one was going to save you if you couldn't keep up. The pack had no room for weaknesses. There was no time for compassion. The alpha, your father, had no patience for failures. The subordinates, those 3 adult wolves who made up the lower ranks of the pack, barely acknowledged your presence. They were too focused on their own roles, patrolling the territory, hunting, defending the pack. They had their own problems to deal with. They didn't care about your struggles. They had their own survival to worry about. The hunts continued, each one a lesson in failure and frustration. Your attempts to contribute were met with failure after failure. The first successful hunt you witnessed, a hare, slipped through the pack's grasp because you weren't quick enough. You were too loud, too clumsy. The next hunt, another attempt at a hare, ended the same way. You were still learning how to move silently, how to approach prey with the stealth of a predator, but every time you tried, something went wrong. Your lack of skill made the pack's efforts more difficult, and that meant less food for everyone. You could see the frustration in the adults' eyes. They were busy trying to survive, to bring down food, to protect the territory. They had no time for a pup who couldn't even contribute to the hunt. They had no patience for you. And the worst part was, you knew you were the one to blame. You couldn't keep up. You couldn't contribute. You were a burden. The days grew colder as winter set in. The snow continued to fall, and the pack had to keep moving to survive. But the cold, the hunger, and the constant exhaustion wore on you. You were starting to feel it in your bones, in your muscles, in every part of your being. You were tired, you were hungry, and yet the pack continued to move, pressing forward, searching for food. You didn't have time to feel sorry for yourself. There was no luxury of self-pity in the Arctic. The pack ate first, as always, and whatever scraps were left over were barely enough to keep you alive. Your mother, though she tried to share what little she had, was too weak to give you much. The other wolves, too, were fighting for their own survival, and you were left to scavenge what you could from the bones of animals the pack had hunted. Sometimes there was nothing left. Sometimes you went to sleep hungry, the gnawing hunger in your belly a constant reminder that life in the Arctic was a battle. You tried to push through it. You tried to keep moving, keep up with the pack, but it was hard. The snow was deep, and your legs were still weak. Your paws sank into the snow, making it harder to move. Every step felt like an effort. Every breath felt like it could be your last. And yet, you kept going. You had no choice. The pack couldn't afford to wait for you. If you couldn't keep up, you would be left behind. One day, during a hunt, things took a turn. The pack had managed to bring down a caribou, a massive animal that could feed them for days. But by the time you arrived, all that was left was the bones. You gnawed on them, trying to convince yourself that you were full. But the hunger persisted, gnawing at you from the inside out. The pack didn't slow down. They kept moving, always searching for more. You had to keep moving too. And so, you did. Even when every step felt like it could be your last, you kept moving. You followed the pack, hoping that one day you would be able to contribute, hoping that one day you would be strong enough to hold your own in the pack. But as the months wore on, the reality of your situation became undeniable. You were still at the bottom of the pack. You were still struggling to survive. You still weren't strong enough, fast enough, or capable enough to contribute. And each day, as you watched your siblings grow stronger, you couldn't help but feel the weight of your failure pressing down on you. The Arctic was a cruel place. It didn't care about your struggles. It didn't care if you were weak, hungry, or tired. It didn't care if you were a pup struggling to survive. The only thing that mattered was whether or not you could make it through another day. And for now, all you could do was keep going. In this part, the wolf pup continues to struggle with the harsh realities of Arctic life, grappling with its place in the pack and the ever-growing pressure to survive. It's a time of internal conflict, frustration, and slow progress. The pack dynamics and the pup's failure to contribute weigh heavily on it, while the constant cold, hunger, and exhaustion force it to dig deeper to find the strength to endure. Let me know if you need any modifications, or if you'd like to continue to the final part. The seasons continue to turn, each one blending into the next, a constant cycle of survival in the unforgiving Arctic wilderness. The winter months had stretched into what seemed like an eternity, but now, with the arrival of spring, you began to feel the subtle stirrings of change. For the first time, you found yourself questioning whether you could truly make it on your own. The pack had moved again, as they always did, following the ever-shifting game trails, searching for food, enduring the same hardships that defined life in this land of ice and snow. But something was different this time. As the pack moved further into the tundra, something seemed to shift within you. You were no longer just a weak, dependent pup. You were becoming something more. With every step you took, every hunt you observed, every failure and every small victory, you were slowly evolving. The land had shaped you in ways you hadn't even realized. It wasn't long before you noticed that the pack was beginning to treat you differently. Your father, the alpha male, had always been indifferent to your existence, seeing you as little more than a mouth to feed. But now, there was a coldness in his eyes when he looked at you. Something had changed. You could sense it. Your mother, too, was preoccupied with the new pups, no longer able or willing to offer you the guidance and care she once had. You were, in a way, being left behind, not intentionally, but as part of the harsh truth of the pack's nature. The survival of the whole meant that the weakest must fall behind, and as the new pups began to grow, they filled the space that you once occupied in your mother's attention. The realization hit you like a thunderclap in the middle of a snowstorm. You were no longer part of the pack. It wasn't a sudden decision, not one made by any single event or action. But one morning, when you woke and found the pack already gone, moving silently in the distance, you understood. They weren't waiting for you. They had moved on, leaving you behind. You were alone. At first, it felt like a relief. The absence of the pack's gaze, the pressure to survive at the bottom of the hierarchy, the constant struggle to find food, it all faded into the background. The weight that had been pressing on your chest for so long lifted. You could breathe freely again. No one would shove you aside for food. No one would growl at you for getting too close to the new pups. You were free to follow your own path. But freedom, in the Arctic, was a bitter thing. You set off, driven by the need to survive, but also by something deeper, a thirst for independence, for a life where you could make your own choices. You didn't know exactly what you were looking for, but you understood that the world was vast, and you were no longer tethered to the pack's oppressive structure. The tundra stretched before you, infinite in its desolation, and you had no destination other than the next step. Each day brought new challenges. You lived on whatever you could catch, rabbits, hares, and the occasional small bird. They were fast and elusive, but you were becoming quicker, your instincts sharpening with every failed hunt and every successful one. You didn't know it yet, but the Arctic was beginning to teach you what you needed to survive. You were becoming a hunter, not just any hunter, but one forged by the harshest of teachers. The land itself was your tutor, and every failure was a lesson learned. But it wasn't easy. The loneliness of life in the tundra began to wear on you. You were a solitary creature now, and while you had always been an outsider in the pack, the reality of being completely alone felt different. There were no packmates to rely on, no shared hunts or warm bodies to huddle with at night. There was just you and the cold. Some nights, the wind howled through the empty land, and you would lie awake, your body curled in a futile attempt to shield yourself from the relentless cold, and you wondered if this was truly what freedom meant. But the thought was fleeting, quickly drowned out by your instinct to survive. You had to keep moving, keep hunting. Then one day, as you were traveling across a flat expanse of snow, you picked up a scent on the wind. It wasn't food, it wasn't a rival pack either. It was something else, someone else, another wolf. At first, you hesitated, unsure whether to investigate, but your instincts told you to follow. Cautiously, you moved towards the source of the scent, keeping low, your steps quiet and deliberate. You could feel your heart racing in your chest. But you knew this wasn't a time for recklessness. The last thing you needed was another confrontation. Soon enough, you spotted her. A lone female, her fur ragged, her body thin but determined, moving with the same grace and caution that you had adopted over the past months. She was alone, just like you. Her eyes met yours across the snow, and for a moment, neither of you moved. There was no hostility in her gaze, no fear. She was sizing you up, just as you were sizing her up. You approached slowly, maintaining a respectful distance. Neither of you spoke. You didn't need to. The silence between you was comfortable, a shared understanding that spoke volumes. You circled each other, sniffing the air, assessing whether the other posed a threat. In the wild, alliances were not built on love or friendship, but on mutual benefit. Survival was always the goal, and for the first time in a long while, you sensed that there was a chance for companionship, not just in a pack, but in the harshness of the tundra. The female did not run. Instead, she tilted her head, as if considering your presence. That was a good sign. You took a few cautious steps forward, and after a long pause, she did the same. It wasn't a romantic tale. It didn't need to be. What you had found wasn't companionship based on affection or sentimentality. It was something more practical. It was survival. Two wolves, alone in the harshest land on earth, finding strength in each other's company. Together you traveled, at first in awkward silence, but soon you began to work as a team. Hunting became easier. You would take turns, one staying alert, watching for predators while the other ate, or one chasing prey while the other kept an eye on the horizon. You were a team now, and together you hunted, fed, and kept each other safe from the dangers of the tundra. But even as you worked together, the Arctic never gave you a break. Every day was a struggle, and every hunt, even with the two of you, was a reminder of the precariousness of life. The land still wanted to kill you, still wanted to take you down, and at any moment, a wrong move could end it all. But this time, you were ready. As spring turned into summer, your bond with the lone female grew. It wasn't love, not in the way humans understood it, but it was something deeper, something more primal. You had both survived, and in a world like this, that was enough. You taught her how to hunt the larger prey, how to track, how to find food in places others might overlook. Together you learned to navigate the endless tundra. And then, one day, she gave birth to 3 pups in a den she dug out in the snow while you were hunting. The weight of responsibility fell on you like a heavy snowstorm. But it felt right. This was your pack now. It wasn't the pack you had been born into, but it was your own. The pups were fragile, small, and utterly dependent on you and the female. You guided them, teaching them how to walk, how to play, how to survive. You taught them the land, how to read the winds and the snow, how to hunt, how to protect themselves. You became the leader of your new pack, the one who would keep them alive no matter what. But it was a hard life. The land had not become any kinder, the challenges were greater, and as the pack grew, so did your responsibilities. You couldn't afford to falter. You couldn't afford to let anyone down. And then, one fateful day, everything changed. While hunting a caribou, you were injured. The pain shot through your leg as the animal's hoof struck you, but you finished the hunt. You pushed through. At first, it didn't seem like much, just a scratch, but the infection spread. The pain intensified. The swelling made it harder to move, harder to hunt, and harder to keep up with your growing pack. The infection spread, and soon it was clear that you couldn't go on much longer. You would become a burden, slow and ineffective. The pack, even your own pups, had no choice but to leave you behind. You understood. The Arctic had no mercy. It had never cared for you. It had only cared that you could survive. And as you lay in the snow, alone once again, you realized that the cycle had come full circle. You had lived. You had led. But now, the land would take you back. In the end, you died alone. The Arctic didn't care. It never did. It just kept going. And so would your pack.